Elon Musk has had a really, really rough week. He has broken the record for the person in all of human history who has lost the most personal wealth ever as a consequence of what looks like his former best friend Donald Trump's decision to tank stock markets all around the world through his insane tariff moves that he has now already caved on, except with China. So Musk is already now a world record breaker in one of the most humiliating ways imaginable. It also looks like he is being evicted from Trump's inner circle. Trump in the last few hours said that he needs nothing from Elon, and Elon, in a sign of breaking with the American government, said that Trump's chief economic architect, Peter Navarro, was a moron and an idiot. And Musk came out and said that he actually wanted no tariffs around the world, flying in the direct contradiction of Trump's American government. So it's been rough. And in South Africa, though, there might actually be some good news for Elon Musk, depending on what happens with Starlink. That is his internet satellite company. He's thrown out thousands of satellites into space, and they're orbiting the Earth, providing internet to lots and lots of people, most significantly in countries like Ukraine. And Elon has been trying to get that launched in South Africa, but he has been rejected by the South African government, quite simply because his company Starlink does not meet the terms required for a company under an act that South Africa has called the Electronic Communications Act. But now the minister in charge of communication and digital technologies, that's Solly Malatsi, he is trying to find a way to circumvent that act to get Starlink into South Africa, even though Elon does and his company do not fulfill the requirements. And there's been a lot of political fighting about that, but it's a really, really important topic, for the simple reason that lots of South Africans still can't afford to, or can't even access, even if they have the hardware, they can't access good internet connections. And we know, in fact, the main argument around the world at this point, given how the world has changed, is that internet access is a human right. You need it to be competitive. You need it to know about the world. You need it to find out about what's happening in your communities. You need it to get jobs and do jobs. And so it's a really, really, really important discussion to have in this country. So let's talk about it. And let's start with a massive dose of disinformation that Elon has already put out on the dark place formerly known as Twitter about this mess with Starlink and South Africa. Because Elon came out and said that Starlink can't operate in South Africa because, quote, "I am not black," which is fundamentally untrue. An absolute bald-faced lie that is simply not the case. He does not have to be black for Starlink to exist in South Africa. This is actually what the Electronic Communications Act says. It mandates that the percentage of equity ownership to be held by historically disadvantaged groups must not be less than 30% for any potential licensee in South Africa's telecommunications sector. That's really, really important to understand, because Starlink, Elon Starlink, has not wanted to change its ownership structure to accommodate country-specific requirements, as written in an article by the Daily Maverick. And so that is a real stumbling block for Starlink. It's not because Elon specifically is not black. That is ludicrous and part of his ongoing attempt to try and frame South Africa as an awfully, awfully racist country that's awfully, awfully awful to white South Africans. It's part of that. But specifically, he does not want to restructure his operations to meet that requirement that all companies operating in South Africa in the telecommunications space face. Now, the DA's minister in charge of communications and digital technologies, Solly Malatsi, believes that he has found a way around this that, in his words, are permissible by law and have been a source of major investments in our economy. What he's trying to do is a policy directive. It's essentially a piece of legislation which is known as an EEIP. It stands for Equity Equivalent Investment Programs, essentially saying that there are other ways that the transformation goals can be met by Starlink if we can pass this piece of legislation that allows Starlink to come into the country. But that has been met with fury by a bunch of other politicians, particularly from the African National Congress, who argue that essentially that the DA's minister is trying to get Starlink in without satisfying South Africa's transformation goals of getting meaningful empowerment for previously and currently disadvantaged groups of people into different companies that work in this country. Now, I don't want to get back into the 142 alleged race laws. We've covered that exhaustively. Eric is sigh laughing in the background. We've covered that exhaustively. As we have said before, South Africa has justifiable laws to try and reshape South African industries on equity, on justice, to try and undo past injustices that still cause a lack of opportunity for people of color, women, and the disabled in South African industries and companies. If you want to call that a race law because it says that we should try and undo some of the inherent racism in South African society that gives white people greater opportunity than people of color, if you want to call that a race law, sure, have a great time with it. But the vast majority of people understand that when there is an inequality based on an injustice, you try to resolve that inequality by equaling the playing field, by making it fair competition, by giving people who by societal construction, inherent societal structure, are at a disadvantage, by giving them a fair chance. That is just what it is. And as I said before, when we were fighting with AfriForum about this, or whoever it was, Institute of Race Relations, when we were fighting with them about this, if you call them 142 race laws, you've also got to call them 142 sex laws and claim that they're sexist, because nearly all of these laws that they mentioned also include trying to get gender justice, trying to give women opportunities. You've also got to call them ableist or disableist laws, because they also include kind of provisions to give disabled people opportunities. So we don't need to get into that. The fundamental understanding, though, is that all companies under the who are going to do communications in this country under the Electronic Communications Act have to have meaningful representation. And frankly, I think that's a good thing, because communications is so vital in any country. Information is, maybe more than any other time in history, power, and how information is used and utilized governs people's understanding of the whole world. And so you kind of want to have companies in charge of that who've got a variety of different perspectives, lived experiences, understandings, and skills, who can meaningfully then manage these companies in just and equitable ways, right? That makes sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there is an argument that the Electronic Communications Act has to be updated, because technologies and information and communications have evolved so much in the last, say, 15 to 20 years, and that piece of legislation has not kept up with it. But I think the core question here is to what extent we believe having Starlink in South Africa is a good idea at all. Because it's clear that the communication minister thinks that it is a good idea, and that others are very skeptical about it. Eric mentioned earlier about Ukraine. It's incredibly stressful to think about individual companies that are now arguably more powerful than countries themselves, because frankly, we are getting to the stage of late-stage capitalism where a company that governs the information dissemination to billions of people can completely warp and control people's understanding of the real. They can completely remove something from their information networks that they can just scrub it. They can wipe it out so that it doesn't exist meaningfully for people. They can remove, as Elon has done, remove fact checkers and remove like any kind of systems to make sure that information is checked over whether or not it is truthful, whether or not it is harmful. It's really scary, because that kind of information dissemination is now more powerful sometimes than whole countries are. And so to give an individual company the power to do that, particularly a foreign-owned company like Starlink, and particularly a kind of company run by the kind of man that Elon is, with what he has done, he fully soft threatened Ukraine through a squabble with some Polish politicians. He fully threatened to take away Starlink from Ukraine, and then said he would never do it afterwards, but he fully threatened that. And Starlink being removed in Ukraine would hammer everyday Ukrainian citizens' ability to stay alive and understand what's going on in the war, but also would hammer many Ukrainian military operatives' ability to do their stuff, because they're relying on Starlink too. Do we really want that kind of person to have that kind of power over many South Africans' ability to access the internet, is what stresses me out. On the other hand, South African internet access is not great. It's better than many countries in the world, but many South Africans still struggle to access good internet, particularly in rural areas, particularly in less infrastructurally developed areas of urban spaces. And even if you do have technical access, like you have signal, You know how expensive data costs are. We know the racket about data costs in South Africa, which means that it is so insanely expensive to just have data to use on the internet, to use on your phone, to use on data and information versus other countries in the world. We do need more meaningful competition. But should it be Starlink is, I think, the core question of this kind of wrestling match, after whether or not Starlink should be made to match the rules and regulations of broadly South African legal transformation goals. And the other thing that's important to remember is that it's not Starlink or nothing, because there are more and more companies now, some of them already working with South African communications providers, telecommunications providers. There are more and more companies now who are putting up their own satellites that can also provide the kind of internet that Starlink can. And so it's not like we have to choose Starlink or we have to choose like the internet dark ages. That's just not the situation here. But that's the debate. And it's a really important one and a big one and prescient now because the minister in charge of communications is literally right now trying to figure out a way to circumvent that law to get Starlink into South Africa. And our second big news story in South Africa, it is now, this week, 10 years, a full decade since Rhodes Must Fall started, when Xhumani Maxwele threw on the Rhodes statue at UCT. It was in, I think, the second week of April 2015. And as we said at the top of the show, it was a wild time for us because you were the programs manager at the campus radio station at the time that I had a talk radio show on.
That is correct.
And on the night after the day where when Xhumani threw that he came up up campus and did an interview with me. And since then, so much has happened that we should talk about. But in the same week where many people have marked a full decade, 10 years since Rhodes Must Fall began, an interview done on the radio station 702, an interview with Petiwe Matutu, who's the CEO of Universities South Africa. The CEO said that South African universities are grappling with 9.3 billion rand in unpaid student debt accumulated by hundreds of thousands of students since 2023. It's not 9.3 billion. It's just in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
9.3 billion rands of student debt because students are unable to pay their fees. And of course, every single year we see student protests at the beginning of the year and universities trying to find accommodation and trying to give fee breaks and asking government to step in and government not stepping in. And so considering it's been 10 years since Rhodes Must Fall started and considering the news of the student debt crisis that is affecting students and universities, we thought it would be good to just reflect on Rhodes Must Fall, what has actually happened since then, what they were trying to achieve in that first year or two that then became Fees Must Fall, and what has actually happened at all. So in interviews with a raft of UCT students now and some UCT students who were there at the time, black students, in interviews over the last week, quite a lot of them have testified that in their opinion, UCT has managed to transform a bit and become a safer, more welcoming, comfortable place for black students, which is great. But they all have said that the UCT has a long way to go also. And I think that that's true of a lot of universities in South Africa to try and become more comfortable and less white dominated, white students in academia, white culture dominated, and more multiracially accepting and comfortable. But the year after Rhodes Must Fall, a lot of that student movement energy went into Fees Must Fall. The argument that universities, that higher education should be free because there are a lot of incredibly deserving students who get phenomenal matric results, or at least good enough matric results to get an opportunity to do higher education. In a country where if you don't have more than a matric, you're going to struggle to get any kind of job, or let alone a decent one. But in a country where if you can get a higher qualification of virtually any kind, at most of the universities in South Africa, that will give you a ticket to a decent job in this country. That is literally, the data supports the way that it goes. And so Fees Must Fall was about students saying, justifiably, we have proven that we deserve to be at this university. We deserve to have the opportunity to get the qualification that will get us a job, that will get us a decent quality of life and transform the fates of a lot of our whole families, right? Because a lot of these are first-time university students and their families trying to make enough money to bring their whole families out of poor circumstances. And the argument was that we shouldn't be denied those opportunities just because we aren't wealthy enough through inheritance or our families to pay university fees, which are very, very high for most South Africans. And when you think about how many South African students trying to go to university are relying on how much wealth their parents have, and their parents were actively denied from accumulating wealth or a decent quality of life by the apartheid state and the apartheid system, it is a bad hand that many students have been dealt, even if they overcome bad quality public education system to get decent enough marks to get into university in the first place. So that's what Fees Must Fall pushed for. If you weren't there, Fees Must Fall students were treated with absolute disrespect and derision by the government, the Department of Higher Education, Bladen Zamanda at the time, making some callous joke about students must fall, and all of these bigwig politicians laughing about it. Since then, what has happened? Well, one of the last things Jacob Zuma did before he lost his presidency was he said, okay, higher education is free. And everyone went, yeah, we won. But higher education is not free. It's not free in this country. They tried to make policies to make it possible for poorer students to get free higher education through organizations like NSFAS, the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, which is an absolute disaster to this day. And the fault is the Department of Higher Education. The fault is the board of NSFAS making insane decisions like last year when they decided to switch the payments process, which suddenly then did not work and left many students unable to even pay for food. There were universities running soup kitchens and food banks for their own students during exams.
Yeah, I mean, some of the reports were, people hadn't been paid any kind of money from NSFAS with that accounts mess up until even in August last year, right?
Yeah.
They've been students since, late Jan, early Feb.
Totally.
August is a long time to go without any kind of even a payment to go buy food.
Totally.
Right? Any kind of allowance.
And we've spoken about this before, but the fact that there are student protests against universities about accommodation and fees access every single year speaks to a systemic issue. It is a structural problem. It is not just, this was a bad year, these things happen. It's the fact that universities don't have enough money to provide accommodation to enough students. Students don't have enough money to pay their school fees. Universities already don't have enough money to cater to the demand. If they are not then getting students' fees, they can't afford to pay for anything at all. It's a structural failing. And my argument is always that the government is failing in this case, and most cases. But in this case, the government is fundamentally failing because the government requires, and I think this is good, the government requires universities to take on more and more students every year, to try and get more and more students opportunities to go to university. That is great. Student body numbers have swelled, have increased in nearly all universities in the country in the last 10 to 20 years. That is very, very good. But when you place pressure on universities to cater for more students, and the students can't afford to pay the school fees that would allow the universities to cater for them, then on a transformation agenda, you as the government have to step in. You have to step in. You have to either make schooling free for some students and actively, effectively pay universities for their housing, their meals, their textbooks, their transport costs, and every other part of them, doing their studies. Or you have to find, or you've got to find other ways to financially subsidize universities so that they can do the job you're asking them to do. Because this is really important. And I remember this about about Fees Must Fall in particular, is there came a moment when a lot of the protesters realized that the universities were in a bind. And some universities didn't care about the protesters, but many universities, even to this day, I believe, sincerely are trying their best. They want students to be able to learn. They want to take in more students. But the balances aren't balancing. The balance sheets can't balance. And the protesters in Fees Must Fall in particular in 2016 then realized that the government has to step in to resolve this. But the government can dodge you. The government is over there in a building, abstractly. The government can fly to a different city. The government can just ignore you. The rationale then is we need to protest against organizations that we can reach, that we can touch, that we can feel, that we can affect, that we can disrupt. In this case, universities, because we can't force the government into listening to us. We can't disrupt them. All we have left then is to disrupt universities in the hope that will force the government to then respond because the universities are being affected. But if the government doesn't respond to that, then universities are just being affected and at some point have no ability to overcome the challenges of no money whatsoever. So this 9.3 billion debt since 2023. That's so much money. That's so much money. Where are universities going to get the money to cover that? They currently can't get the money to cover that. I sincerely believe that they want to help all of these students and have all of these students get educated. But where's the money going to come from to solve this problem? If the government doesn't do it, and some political parties, to be fair, have called for debt relief and debt forgiveness and that, it just seems obvious to me that that is what has to happen. But the problem is often that university students have a massive outsized influence on the discourse because they're in educated spaces and institutions where a lot of people who now have jobs have gone from, so will listen to. But university students are actually a very small number of people out of all of South Africa. University students are actually a very small number of people just out of the youth of South Africa. And so when it really comes down to it, politicians don't see university students as potential voters they need to care about. They can care about others. They can deal with other problems and other issues which they feel are going to get them more voters. Students fundamentally can be disregarded and can be ignored and put in a box and put away, as they have been for a very long time by major political parties. And that's what needs to be overcome, is somehow political parties need to make the plight of students so agenda set that they become an actual voting political issue, I think. Because let's be honest, disrupting universities is an effective way of getting some students relief, but it's not an effective way of systemically changing the systemic crisis, the structure that is causing these failings every single year, and ultimately punishing students the most, but also punishing universities and affecting universities' ability to give anybody decent education. And so 10 years after Rhodes must fall, and I'm sure there'll be big commemorations next year for 10 years after fees must fall, I'm not sure, man. There've definitely been successful projects of transformation that have made universities, by all testimony, feel better for people of color to study at and to work at. But in many universities, many people of color still feel deeply alienated and cast out. Because the university system was built for very few white people to get very well educated. And ever since then, universities have done their best to try and evolve. Most of them have, not all of them, but most of them. And the government for a while was helpful, but now is fundamentally failing. And that causes no structural change. And that's what really, really, really needs to happen.